Welcome to the Frontier Leader Show. Today is the Frontier Brief for May 8th, 2026.
Hello and welcome to the Frontier Leader Show. I'm Martin Wheatley, and most weeks I speak and have interviews with leaders, coaches, practitioners and technologists working out what good leadership looks like in an AI-shaped world. However, this one is a monthly cycle that I'm going to start calling the Frontier Brief, and it's my monthly filter on what is happening in technology and AI and what it means for leaders running real businesses or within real businesses. I'm not going to cover everything that happened during the month. I'm just going to cover 2-3 things that I think are most topical that people need to know about so that they can see how things are unfolding in the real world. So without further ado, let's dive into the first item. And the first one is an OpenAI research paper that came out titled The AI Jobs Transition Framework. And this is a paper published by OpenAI mapping 921 occupations across roughly 150 million jobs in the US. And they mapped this against near-term AI exposure. And the headline kind of numbers is that 18% of the roles that they mapped would face higher short-term automation risk from AI. 46% are likely to see less change, and 36% in the middle could either grow, change, or shift into something else as a result of augmenting this technology with humans. The concrete stat within that is, within that 18% of roles impacted in the short term, the theoretical exposure of AI within those roles is 90%. So AI could complete 90% of the tasks within those roles. That's the theoretical exposure that OpenAI have come up with. But in reality, the realized exposure is roughly 24%. So roughly 24% is actually being done versus 90%. So that's a big difference, and that mirrors to some extent what the Anthropic research paper was that came out earlier in the year, and it was roughly the same numbers. 90% of tasks within certain fields could be automated with AI versus 20 to 30% that is. Now, when you look at the numbers behind that, if you compare that to the 148 million, you're looking at roughly 6.5 million jobs essentially has been currently impacted by AI in the US as a result of this study, which, it is a significant number, but it just goes to show that there's a small slither of what is actually being done versus what is capable of being done. And, similar to the Anthropic paper, obviously OpenAI and Anthropic want to promote how much that their product feasibly could be used to do in the workplace. So, there is a grain of salt to be taken with this when you're reading these and understanding the numbers behind it. But for someone who's leading a business and you're lying awake thinking about AI replacing you or your workforce, the gap within there is your breathing room at the minute. But it is also a bit of a comfort trap. Most organisations aren't using the time to build anything. We're not seeing that economic impact or productivity impact yet on a mass scale. So the question isn't, when does the automation arrive? It's, what are we doing with that gap in the meantime? And, my other article about the whole restructure of a block under Jack Dorsey, and, is it short-sighted to remove all those heads straight away and all that? Those kind of thoughts need to be thought about when you're looking at what's capable versus what isn't. So that was an interesting piece. It's worth a read just to understand what OpenAI are looking at and how they are positioning towards a more enterprise and work focus. The second item is from Anthropic, and this is the Anthropic Economic Index, and it's specifically around learning curves. And this came out at the end of March, but they're now publishing data to show how Claude usage is shifting. And basically, what this report was saying was that the people who tend to use Claude or have been using Claude more recently and more thoroughly has a 6.4% higher task success rate than someone who is only just starting to use it now. So you extrapolate this out and you can actually see that the question is no longer who has access to these tools, because a lot of people do, but it's who's getting better at using them as the time goes on. And those are different problems with different solutions. Most organizations, or a lot of organizations, are still grappling on how to implement these technologies in their processes with their people. There is a big element of shadow AI where people are using tools that aren't sanctioned by a company. But it just goes to show that the more you use them, the better you get at using them, which I suppose to some extent is common sense. But the difference now is starting to be visible on how people are using them and the effectiveness that it could have. And you're already getting people that are starting to pull away from those who aren't using them. So that's just something to bear in mind. And the kind of final article is in relation to a Chinese court case. And in a nutshell, what happened is a Chinese court upheld a ruling against an employer who moved a quality inspector to a lower paid role because AI could do most of his role. And when he refused to do that, they dismissed him. So he basically took them to court for unfair dismissal. And the whole argument is that AI could do his original job more cheaply. So the company were trying to leverage that and move him out and reduce the cost. And the court basically ruled that cheaper AI and replacing people with cheaper AI is not by itself a valid redundancy justification. So the court pointed specifically employers towards training, upskilling, reasonable reassignments and fair compensation when AI changes roles using their existing labour laws. There hasn't been a new AI-specific statute created, but it has sent a clear signal from the Chinese judicial system, if you like. I know it's slightly different to over here. This was more of a civil court, as far as I understand it. This is a significant issue for companies as they look to implement AI, transform how they do things, and really leverage their people and the technology to add value. Companies and leaders now need to be aware of these dynamics that are happening across the world on how people are handling and adapting to restructuring with AI. The Chinese courts have started to draw that line in the sand and say you cannot restructure and lay people off just because you can get AI to do it cheaper. Now, is that the long-term answer to making sure that people are protected in the workplace when AI comes in? I'm not too sure. It's a hot debate. For one, I'm not sure which side this is going to land on. But the whole point of implementing AI into a workspace, in my opinion, is to make people better, is to add more value, and is to help your people deliver more for what you need to do. It's to unlock capacity and to unlock value in the process for you, for the clients, for them. So just purely using AI as a tactic to reduce costs, I think, is very short-sighted, and in the long run, companies will suffer. So is this a good decision by the courts in China? Do you think this is something that should be supported across the world to protect people? That's an interesting debate that's probably going to be happening. So those are the main three kind of articles and the talking points from each of them. I was at a session on a Q&A panel last week in Leeds, the AI confidence meetup, and conversation and the Q&A questions weren't so much about the tools and the model or which AI is best. It was about implementing AI. What are the practical steps that companies can take? What teams succeed? Where are the challenges, etc., rather than just buying a license and hoping that something happens. And it is about implementing that judgment in the process and that judgment within a transformation. And leaders who've given their teams access but haven't changed anything about how they themselves work, that is a challenge that the panel was seeing. People sometimes think that AI is something that happens in the organisation to their teams, but not necessarily to leaders in general. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. You need the senior leadership to buy in, to test the tools, to see what's capable with them so that everyone can learn together. And I think, the conversations I'm having are around the successful companies are ones that go through that learning process together and understand what's good, what's bad, what are the guardrails, what are the use cases, and how can we adapt to it. It's uncomfortable. You get to a certain point in leadership, people expect you to have all the answers. So it is uncomfortable to admit that as a leader, you're unsure of how to use these and where it's going to lead, because nobody really has the answer yet, as we've just proven from the Chinese court cases and the OpenAI and Anthropic research papers. And it is causing discomfort, and it will cause discomfort to leaders who defer. The gap isn't necessarily the tool. It's the leader's relationship with the tool and how they can channel that with their people. So that's where we are sat now. If we look at the conversation I had with Julian Shomig in episode 4, now he runs a 25-person fintech company called Diesta. And he's built the internal processes with his team. He's built the internal MCP, model context protocol servers that pull from company code base, documentation, and operational logs. So he can get an up-to-date picture of what's happening in his company. He can use those connections to answer questions, to form his thinking when he's in front of a client or just before he goes in front of a client, to stress test his ideas before he provides it to his team. And they have leveraged vibe coding to some extent, where they are prototyping very quickly changes that could be made. Now, it's preventing that whole long development cycle and actually turning up to a meeting with a prototype running and working. That couldn't be done a year ago without extensive lead time. So that kind of environment where he's nurturing that within his team and his business is where he's going to start getting leverage against larger players and larger institutions that perhaps can't move as quickly. But I think the key thing is that he has developed this with his team. He has felt the learning experience himself and has led his company towards thinking down this route, along with his CTO. And, they made that conscious decision to do that. Not every company can do it as quick, obviously. I'm not naive in that aspect, but it's certainly taken that first step. And he's not doing it because it's trendy. He's doing it because the interruption cost of pulling the wrong person out of their own flow day to day is costly. It takes them 15, 20 minutes to get back into what they were doing, into their deep work, if you like. And, they've made this conscious decision so that it can help leverage people's time and knowledge. And what's useful about the example is that's his technical solution. It's the underlying question he's answered. How do I lead better, and where does AI belong in how I actually work, which is what he's answered. And a lot of leaders may not have considered that yet and may not have asked themselves yet because the technology is so new and they're not as close to the front line. So look, all that combined, the data says that the value gap is shifting towards learned usage now. The court ruling in China says restructuring around AI without a plan is now a legal risk, and the conversations say that most leaders haven't yet made this personal. All three are pointing at the same kind of gap. And the term I want to copy from the OpenAI report is the capability overhang. And it describes the gap between what AI could theoretically do and what it's actually doing. And I think that applies just as well to leadership. Most businesses have a capability overhang right now. The tool can do more than the people inside are getting out of them, and the gap isn't closing by itself. The Anthropic data makes it clear that this is a skill curve, not a familiarity curve. Access doesn't necessarily close the gap to this. It's combined repetitive, iterative practice, which means if you've just bought people licenses to Microsoft Copilot, communicate a policy, and you think you've done, that isn't enough in itself. And, there is the conversation that it's not quite there yet. It only gets you 80% of the way. But, if I look back to the conversation I had with Ian Morrison on episode 1, AI gets you 80% of the way there. And it's the experience and the judgment of the person using it and the real world grounding that 20% actually makes it value add to you, to the company, to your clients. It's not a reassuring message about job security. It's a challenge because most organizations aren't building that 20% deliberately. They're hoping it develops on its own just by giving the tool. And look, this window is not permanent. The capability overhang exists because the tools are still new enough that shallow use feels like enough. So when the models are so capable that even shallow use produces visible output, the advantages shift entirely to the people who have started to learn early. And that is happening now. So I think from my perspective, it's definitely the teams who win are the ones who lead together. They're the ones who go deep in the tools and understand what's possible and what's not. And this isn't a quick fix. This will require time. It will require a structured transformation to get this across a company, across an organization. Let's not underestimate how this happens, but the first domino to fall needs to be from a leadership position to understand and set the message and set the tone. So where in your own working week are you still using AI at a surface level, if you are using it at all? Are you using it as a faster search or a quicker draft tool when you could actually be using it to change how you think and how you lead and how you interact with your people? That's it for this month's Frontier Brief. I hope you've enjoyed the format. I'd love to hear if there's anything else that you specifically want covering. If you have found this useful, please hit the follow or subscribe if you haven't already. And a review or a rating does help the show, and I do genuinely appreciate it. I have a growing number of resources available at theAIleaderlab.com. The link will be in the show notes. Please do check it out and continue to learn, continue to experiment with AI to enhance your leadership. Bye-bye for now.